Hi, my name is John Flett. I'm a pediatrician who helps families, children, young adults, teachers and schools with children that think and learn a little differently. So how about ADHD during adolescence and the teenage years? You've heard of three-nagers. At 3 and at 13, they're kind of similar ages. That toddler tantrums, those terrible 2s turning 3s. Yes, you've guessed it. Instinctively, you know that adolescence is a challenging time. Because let's face it, as adults, we've all been there. So think back, just think a little differently about how you kind of went through your adolescence. And it might give you a little bit of sympathy and consideration for your children that are entering that time period. So we all know that it's a time of mood swings, hormonal, extensive changes. Remember, from the moment you're born into a dictatorship. You have your parents that do everything for you. And then at the final hurdle, when you leave home, theoretically, you're going to be living in a democracy, self-sufficient. All parents want that for their kids. You are able to, as a parent, take a step back as your child takes a step forward in self-control and independence. So think about adolescence is that transition period. In order to decouple themselves from you and the system, schooling, to become an independent adult, they've got to show a separation. They've got to show that they're different. They've got the independent thinking. The prefrontal cortex, which is basically the driver of the brain, the self-control, the area of the brain that has your executive functions, that helps control you in your everyday life, only fully develops at the age 25. So during the teenage years, it's not quite there yet. I think we'll all agree about that. So, apart from the biology that's changing, socially, sexually, these are things that are impacting. And of course, as a parent, I'm sure you're all worried, we're all concerned about the academics. We know how important education is. Because if we get it right during high school, it sets up for a successful, college, university, jobs, careers, family, relationships. So we've got to keep our eye on the ball, as it were. ADHD symptoms persist into teenage years. 85% of kids who had a diagnosis at the age of 7 will still have those symptoms during the teenage years. And then during adulthood, about 60% persist. So these are a couple of things that, we've got to think about that change during teenage years. There's a lot more responsibility. We've got only one child in a class with many teachers. At the junior school, you've got one teacher with many children. One teacher can keep an eye on things. At high school, it changes. And, when I talk to teenagers, I often kind of get the impression that they don't really understand the ADHD. No one's had a chance to sit down and help them understand what is ADHD. And when they understand the importance of taking their medication. They won't have the resistance to take the medicine. The importance of motivating, making sure that they understand what the goal is of the treatment of ADHD, to take it every day. There has to be incentive, there has to be motivation. Everybody gets out of bed for something. So I find motivation is a major issue during adolescence. That emotional control, making sure that they have sustained attention, planning, organization. It's not a time for parents to kind of say, during the teenage years, my child's got to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. They've got to sometimes just remember to take their own medication. Yes, we've got to allow them, and we expect from them to become more organized and to have a more kind of planning. But don't expect somebody with ADHD to do those on their own. Remember, ADHD is an immaturity. They are 2 to 3 years behind other children for the same age. So that's something you've really got to keep an eye on. So children can be actually diagnosed as late into teenage years. If a child is smart, they've been well organized, they've had a very kind of controlled and organized school, teachers, parents, that diagnosis might only present during the teenage years, because when those demands happen to high school, those executive functions are not as well controlled, and they have difficulty, handing in projects, completing tasks. They might be very bright, but you can't just wing it at high school. Sometimes those times, that is when we see those symptoms. And, when they reach 17, that's when we talk about adult ADHD. So the criteria we use after 17 is a little bit more flexible, and they don't need quite the same symptoms. And kids are not as hyperactive at high school. So teachers are expecting a child with ADHD to be hyperactive, very kind of impulsive, but not. They might just be very inattentive, dreamers. They don't always show those symptoms. Sometimes teachers just think they're lazy, they're just not, they don't care. And, they kind of looked at just, they need a little bit more discipline. But I see a lot of children who present over this time period during adolescence. So a couple of things just to think about. This is the time that kids are going to come up against and be tempted with drug and habitual use of substances. Pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, not being motivated, having low scores with their marks, higher rates of, not completing high school with ADHD. And of course, regrettably, internet and social media abuse and use. They're starting to even get their licenses. So they've got they're getting either a motorbike license at 16, or of course, learning to drive. These are very worrying things. So, the type of things that we're tending to see now, vaping, and alcohol abuse and use. So, during adolescence, it's a time to be vigilant, to make sure as parents that your child takes their medication. If you're worried that they're becoming socially withdrawn, sometimes I see children with complex ADHD present. They've been treated for the ADHD, but then they become socially withdrawn, socially kind of inept, mood, anxiety, sitting in their rooms, not wanting to interact with the family and friends, just living this virtual world online. And, sometimes kids start to cut themselves, they kind of show the signs of suicidal sort of thoughts if they don't get the right help. Exercise, making sure that they participate in sports, making sure that they have social interactions, and to discuss the medications. ADHD medicines might need to be adjusted. The medicines they used at junior school might not be appropriate for high school. They need sometimes additional medication in the afternoon and the evening to help with their studies and focus. So there's a lot of demand during adolescence. And then, of course, particularly for girls, they're the ones that kind of are the inattentive. They don't show that emotional necessarily impulsivity or hyperactivity. And they're at specific risk for things like teenage pregnancy, STDs, depression, and anxiety. So that needs a specific intervention and assistance. So these are things that I tend to deal with. A large percentage of my practice is at high school, and I find it useful to actually have the discussion, particularly with the teen. So these are problems that you recognize. Post your emails, post your kind of comments in the group, and we'll talk soon.